Officially, finally. Well,
No,
not quite
it's on
officially,
June
but
21st.
finally, it's summertime. And so we just thank God for warm weather. It was a long winter. It was a long winter. Amen. Well, today is Flag Day, so if everybody would join me, we're going to stand and say our pledge allegiance to the flag today. Hand over your heart. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, it's been a while, huh? Wow. Man, something just happened. Man, yeah, so today is Flag Day, 1777, June 14th, 1777. The flag was adopted for the nation of America. And we were in the throes of a Revolutionary War. And in the heat of battle, in the heat of war, it was not a moment of let's wait and see how this thing plays out before we actually have a flag, before we actually adopt our Declaration of Independence. Let's not wait and see how this thing plays out. It was in the midst of this, we are going to be a nation, we are a nation, and we will adopt the things that create us as a nation, regardless of the battles that are raging around us. And that is how America started. That is the seed that was sown for America. The idea, the concept of freedom in America it's not a fanciful idea. It's not some idea that we have come by lightly. It's not some idea that we have no grasp of or understanding of as a nation. It is something that we have time and time again continuously fought for and have maintained since the day of our inception. And it is those freedoms which we find ourselves once again in 2020 battling to maintain. The difference now is that instead of it being from outside forces, it is from forces within. And there are those forces within this country that would seek to dismantle it and the freedoms that we have obtained and the freedoms that we have founded this nation on. And so we find ourselves in a battle, and I wonder, in the midst of this battle, if our mentality and our mindset is one of we will maintain our freedoms rather than we have to fight for our freedoms. We fight from our freedoms, not for our freedoms. Yep. We've already won the battle for our freedoms. Right. And now we fight from them. A lot of things happened this day in history. Of course, the best thing, I was born. Right? I mean, come on, that was funny. But there's a lot of things that happened in this day in history. Today is also President Trump's birthday. 1946, June 14th, he was born. There's a great video. I did not have the ability to get it downloaded, otherwise I'd be playing it right now. But if you go on EJ's page, it's on there. You can click on the link. It is about Donald Trump and his birth and everything that surrounded all of that. The revival that was taking place when his mother went to and they used the Bible, his mother's Bible, and the significance of what that meant when he actually walked to the church and held up his mother's Bible. There's a lot more taking place in the spiritual realm in this moment than most believers are aware of. And I would encourage you to check it out because it changes your whole understanding, your whole perception of what God is doing. You see, God formed and fashioned Donald Trump in his mother's womb for this battle.
Yeah.
This is his destiny. This fight. It is his destiny. He's walked through many battles before. He tried to step in to places where it wasn't his destiny, right?
Yeah.
The last time he ran for president, way back when. It wasn't his time. It wasn't his destiny. The situations that were transpiring in America at that time, it was not his destiny to deal with those issues. His destiny was now. I mean, think about it. Just for a moment. It's like we look at our lives and we say, you know, we talk about how God created us for purpose. And God created us for a plan. And sometimes in our lives we get frustrated because life seems like it has gone on so long, and it just seems like I've never done anything that seemed like or felt like I had actually fulfilled the plan of God for my life. And here Donald Trump is, 70-some years later, just now fulfilling the destiny for his life. His life, he had to walk through 70 years of his life before he got to his destiny. So be patient. Because your destiny may still yet be coming. It may not be over yet. Even when it seems like there's nothing left. Even when it may seem like it's done. Even when it may seem like perhaps I missed it. I mean, the other thing to think about is look at the life that Donald Trump had lived. Right? Was he an avid follower of Christ? No. Was he in church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night kind of guy? No. Was he a clean living kind of guy? No. Did he have a great moral standing kind of guy? Not always, huh? Did he miss the destiny and plan that God had placed on his life?
No.
No. It's not a license to sin, right? But it's an understanding that God's providence is sometimes bigger than what we give God credit for.
Yeah. Yes. That's good.
And that there are certain individuals who are created to be in this world for certain key moments in time.
Absolutely.
And those individuals will not so easily walk past their appointed time for destiny. Some other things happen. June 14th happens to be a day that is surrounded throughout the annals of history with civil unrest and revolution. On this day in history, another individual was born, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Many of you know who she is. She is the author that penned the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that book was one of the main instigators, if you will, to the Civil War. Because Uncle Tom's Cabin directly dealt with the issues of slavery. And it did it to a point where it got a lot of people upset. It was a revolutionary book, and it started to get people thinking in terms of revolution. And I looked up revolution and revolutionary, and revolution or revolutionary is this idea of bringing a drastic change that is completely different than what previously was. And so, as we look through this day in history, and as we look at the events that surround June 14th, we see that there were several issues that dealt with civilities, that dealt with race, actually. In 1940, June 14th of 1940, Auschwitz received its first Jewish prisoners. On June 14th of 1811, Napoleon, or not 1811, 1807, Napoleon won one of his major battles. 7 years earlier, 1800, June 14th, Napoleon won another major battle. These are moments for revolution. Whether you agree with their stance, whether you say this is right, this is biblical, it doesn't change the reality of what was taking place. And the reality of what was taking place is that as you look back through history, time after time after time, on June 14th, revolution is happening. And so we come back to our current time and we say, what is happening on June 14th, 2020 in the United States? What is taking place in this time? Civil unrest. America is burning.
Last night, Atlanta.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's just, and it's ramping up.
yeah.
And every day it kind of, you start to feel like maybe there's a lull, maybe things are,
Oh,
and then you get a report just about the time you feel that. You get a report, well this happened, and it just, it's just a continuation. And I believe what we what God is wanting us to look at and see and understand is that now is the time for a spiritual revolution.
Yes.
Now is the time for a spiritual revolution. We look at all of this stuff. I've really been digging into some of this stuff because I've really been seeing a lot of the headlines, and I've been seeing a lot of the issues. I've been seeing the so-called social justice movements, the different ones that are out there that are standing and promoting different things. I see the big cities that are the city councils that are trying to overthrow the police departments and to say, well, we don't need you anymore. It's like, have you lost your mind?
exactly.
It's like, have you seen what happened in Detroit when they could no longer afford to have as big of a police presence as they once had? Have you seen what happens in Chicago when they can no longer afford to have as great of a police presence as they have? Have you seen what's happened in LA and in some of these big major cities where gangs are a huge problem? And have you seen what happens when the cities can no longer afford to maintain a police presence in some of these neighborhoods? And now these very cities, Minneapolis, New York, these very cities are wanting to strip their police officers out of their cities. And somehow we're going to introduce a kumbaya type of justice where, hey, now, be nice. Don't do that. Bad, that's bad.
Yeah.
They're talking in Minneapolis, they're talking about, instead of a police officer doing a show up on a domestic violence call, they're going to send a therapist. Are you nuts?
Yeah.
In the middle of a heated domestic violence moment, you're just going to send an unarmed therapist to try to talk it out.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
You've lost your mind.
Yeah.
Even from the standpoint of restorative justice has long since had a very hard thought process of how to deal with cases of domestic violence, because it is a totally different animal.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can just go into untrained and unknowing. It's not something, even in the aftermath of domestic violence, restorative justice is not something that can actually transpire or take place without individuals having the proper training. Because when you put those two individuals at the table, what is going to happen is just by a look, there's going to be a re-victimization. And you're just going to send a therapist into the middle of the actual heated moment. We're not talking 2 years after the event took place and now she has questions that only he can answer that she desperately wants to know. Okay, we're talking in the middle of the heated moment when he is threatening to kill her. He may have a weapon, may not, and you're going to send an unarmed person into that situation. All right, everybody just calm down. Let's take a breath. Nuts. I can tell you that unless it is, if some of this stuff goes through, then unless it is actually a directive from God, we will not be traveling through any of those cities.
No.
That's retarded.
Yeah.
I'm not going to travel through a major city that had crime issues when there was a police presence, that no longer has a police presence. You're nuts. I'm not going anywhere near it.
Yeah.
The only way I would ever go is if God said you need to go.
Yeah.
That's right.
And then there may be a little part where I might be kicking and screaming a little bit, but we would get there. We have a generation of individuals who are so spiritually blinded because they have no spiritual light within them.
That's right.
And individuals who have spiritual light who refuse to share the light of the Spirit that is within them. That these things are just like wildfire in a dry grass field. And once a blaze catch, it just... There's no fire break. You understand? There's no fire break. We were created to be a fire break. You know that, right?
That's the church's role.
You know what happens when something starts on fire? You get a field on fire out here in Wyoming with all this brush and this grass, this dry grass in the winter and the wind. You know what happens? Most of the time the fire department doesn't go anywhere near the fire. The firefighters, BLM people. Most of the time they'll drive 15 miles away, they'll get way out in front of the fire and they'll dig a big old swath. They'll cut a big old swath and clear all of the vegetation for about 30, 40, 50, 100 feet wide on each side. So that the fire, when it hits that, it can't continue on. There's no more fuel for it. You go and clear out the fuel before the fire gets to the fuel. Blessed are the peacemakers. What does that really mean? It doesn't mean you run headlong into the fire.
Right.
It means you go out in front of the fire and you get the fuel out of the way. So that when the fire gets there, it has no more fuel to continue to feed on. And it dies. Galatians chapter 6. We were finishing up our series in Galatians, and it goes right hand in hand with the word that Alicia shared. It goes hand in hand with everything that is taking place. And it goes hand in hand with the day in which we find ourselves, Flag Day, June 14th. Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says, "Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load." Now this first part of the scripture is a little bit confusing because in one verse it says we're going to bear each other's burdens, and in another verse, like even just 2 verses down, it says each one has to bear his own load. And it's like, what? When I was studying this out, it becomes clear what is intended when it says, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, that word overtaken is actually defined as being overcome like by a surprise attack. It's like you didn't see it coming. It just, something came out of nowhere, it just hit you out of the blue, and it overtook you, and you couldn't even fight. You didn't even have the wits about you to fight the thing. You just, boom. And it's actually, in this reference, it's actually talking about an issue of sin. And to understand that there are moments where, yes, every sin is actually a choice. We're not faultless, right? But there are times where these things can come at you so quickly and so fast, and you're not prepared for it, and you haven't done any work to gird yourself, or you didn't even know that you had to in this area, and next thing you know, you're just hit out in left field, and it just completely overtakes you. And this is an encouraging word to the body of Christ that says in this moment, in these instances, it's not the place to heap condemnation on people. Right? Because they didn't see this coming. There was no way they could have prepared for it. I mean, yeah, they're spiritual, right? If one of your brothers who seems to be spiritual finds himself overtaken, finds himself in a fault, bear his burdens with him. Help lift him up. The context here of what it's talking about is work with him to restore him to a place of right standing, right relationship, and fellowship with the Lord. You come up alongside him. A lot of times people, they don't even know that what they're doing. When these kinds of things happen, they get overtaken, they get hit out of left field, they don't even know that sometimes they've been hit. Until somebody comes up alongside them and says, hey brother, hey sister, I just want to, I've seen this taking place. And it's not in accordance with the Word of God, and I want to bring it to your attention because it's not right. And we need to come back over here because this is the path that God would have us to walk. This is the placement for us. Can I help you? Is there anything you need? How can I help you? What do you need at this moment to get back into that place? Because that's where God truly wants you to be. And so we help bring them. But keep in mind, see, before we step out into that position and before we step out to help those individuals, the idea is to keep in mind that you have to know yourself. In restorative justice, one of the things that I learned the quickest in my training was that you can really mess some things up really badly if you don't know yourself. We had this moment where we were doing this mock case of this kid that had been bullied, and the bully really hurt the kid and then took their stuff, stole the stuff from the kid. And this was just a mock case. This wasn't a real thing. And we were set up in different teams to handle different parts of this situation and to walk through this in a restorative manner. And so they put me up as a facilitator to come in and discuss with the bully and talk with them, to do the pre-conference. You talk with each side of the situation that happened before you bring them together. And so I'm talking to this person who's just playing the role of the bully, and somewhere in this conversation something just flipped for me, and I started to really get verbally aggressive with the bully, trying to get them to come to a certain place of understanding. And the person who was assigned as my co-facilitator said, hey, whoa, what's going on? And I said, well, what do you mean what's going on? They said, why are you taking this so personally? This is just a mock case. This isn't even real. What's going on? See, what I didn't realize in that moment is that because when I had grown up and went through school, I had been extremely horribly picked on as a child. I had been bullied to the furthest extents. I mean, groups of kids come and beat me up. And so this all started to come out in this thing, and I was getting really angry at the bully, and it's like, you need to admit this, and you need to, it's like, whoa, what? It's time out, right? What's going on? See, I didn't know myself. I took on a case that was too personal. And because of that, I was ineffective in my ability to actually bring justice. So when we see people and we think they're, oh man, they're dealing with this, you better know yourself before you start to restore them, lest you also be tempted and drawn away.
Yeah.
If you're too close to the situation, you're not the person for the job. If those issues are actually problems in your life, you're not the person for the job. So you're not the one who needs to actually work to restore that person back to lest you also be tempted, lest you also fall. It's vital that you know yourself. It's vital that you understand the things that set you off. We understand this in the area of ministry because if we minister from a place of woundedness, we're going to create further woundedness. And we're not going to actually bring healing. We can't minister healing in those places until we ourselves have actually received healing.
That's right.
Because then we'll just make a mess out of things. That speaks to the bottom one there, verse 4. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another, for each one shall bear his own load. The choices we make, those are ours. And we carry those. We live with those. And they're ours alone. No matter how much somebody can come and help, no matter how much somebody can come and try to restore, no matter how much somebody can think they're doing the right thing, and oh brother, and yes, amen, hallelujah, but you know what? My past is mine alone. And there are things that I will go through in my life as a result of what I've done in my life that is my load to bear, and nobody else can bear it for me, regardless of how much somebody would try. And God is gracious, and God removes some of those things out of my past, and He gives me grace for those things in my past. And yes, there's been forgiveness. Yes, there's been overcoming of those issues. But guess what? There are still going to be times in my life where I am faced with the horrible realities of my past, and those are my burdens to bear. And there's nothing that anybody can do about it. This is a place of really, really just being intentional in our walk with the Lord. Being intentional in our Christianity. Being intentional in our relationships. Being intentional in the way that we move through this life. Why am I talking about all of this in this moment in time in history? Because now more than ever it is important for us to be intentional with how we live our lives. The choices that every individual on this earth make in this moment are going to drastically affect generations to come. We have in this moment, we have a divine opportunity in this moment. Do you realize what is actually happening in this moment? The fields are white unto harvest, and God is looking for the laborers. But we also have in this moment something that is about to transpire that we see in the Word of God, where the harvesters are going to catch up with the planters. See, we have the planters, the ground is being fertile, the ground is being set, and the furrows are being cut in the ground of this nation right now. There are furrows being cut in the ground of this nation for seed to be planted, seed after seed after seed. But what are we going to plant? What are we really planting in this moment? You see, as believers, we get this idea that we're coming into the greatest harvest of all time. Yes, but you know what happens in the aftermath of the harvest? You've got to plant a new crop. There's got to be more planting. What are we planting? What are we planting in this moment? 1776. Declaration of Independence signed. Every single one of those individuals were considered to be traitors. What were they planting? There was good, right? There was good. But would we think that our founding fathers were such perfect men that there wasn't anything bad planted along with the good? planted for the next 100 years in this nation? What were the things that were the seeds that were sown? Verse 6, let him who is taught the word share in all good things with him who teaches. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. See, ultimately, this nation was birthed because of the providence of God, right? God had a plan that one day America would fulfill a destiny. That America needed to exist in order to fulfill a destiny for the providence and plans of God. So this nation needed to be birthed. So God's hand was directly in the birthing of this nation. But don't think that God's hand directly in the birthing of this nation removed the ability for man to sow corrupt seed in the inception of this nation as well. There are things that we are reaping today. Do you realize that? We're reaping them today. And at the same time, as we're reaping them, because we're not actually looking to the truth of the Word of God for how to move beyond these moments in time, we reap and then we sow the same seed that we're reaping.
We do.
And then there's another generation that ends up reaping the same harvest. The same harvest. The same harvest. In 1776, there were seeds that were being sown that weren't in accordance with the Word of God. There was a generation that reaped a harvest. And when that generation reaped the harvest in 1850 something, reaped the harvest of a 4-year war that was the bloodiest battle on the face of this planet. In one war that cost the lives of more men than we have ever seen in our history as a nation since. And there were people that were sowing the same seeds as what they were harvesting. So then there was another generation 100 years later. 1960s, 1950s, that started to reap a harvest of seeds that were sown. And guess what? Some of those individuals were sowing the same seeds of the harvest that they were reaping. Come out here now in 2020, and guess what? Here we are again reaping a harvest. What are we going to do with the seed? What are we going to do with the seed? Don't plant bad seed. Don't plant bad seed. How do we stop getting a bad harvest? Stop planting bad seed. Stop planting bad seed. Start sowing good seed. And someday, guess what? The tide of harvest will change. And you will start to reap all good harvest, and there will be no more bad harvest. You eventually get to the place where you run out of bad harvest because you have at some point in time stopped sowing bad seed. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. What are we sowing in this time? We get this idea that, well, because I'm a believer, I'm sowing spiritually in this moment.
Right.
Are you aligning with these groups of anger and hate in this moment? Are you aligning yourself with their message? Because if you are, you're not sowing seeds of the Spirit, you're sowing seeds of the flesh. You're reaping a harvest, and in the midst of this harvest, guess what you're doing? You're planting the seed that you're reaping. It doesn't matter if you're a believer or not. So many believers out there in this moment are sowing this harvest. They're sowing it back.
Yep.
They're sowing it back.
True.
Where's the change going to be? When does that change come? It's not going to be the next harvest. You know the interesting thing about sowing and reaping? You always get more back than what you put in.
That's a sad
Your
part.
bad.
Yep.
It works both sides, right?
Right.
I mean, think about it this way. If I planted good seed, I would actually reap more than what I sowed. That's just a reality.
Yeah.
But the same follows suit on the other side. If I sow bad seed, I'm going to reap more than what I sowed.
Yeah.
I just went in and stole one thing. Cost me 5 years of my life. I mean, it took 5 minutes. 5 minutes cost 5 years.
Yeah. Puts it in perspective.
I reaped way more than I sowed.
Yeah.
That was a pretty quick turnaround, too. That crop was like, the germination period was like, right now. It was a weed. Weeds grow so fast.
Oh, they do.
It's like you pull one out, and the next day there's another one in the same spot, twice as big as the one you just pulled.
Yeah.
It's like, how?
Weeds are easy.
There was a seed that was planted. How do we sow good seed in this moment? Because that's really the question, right? See, it's not so much about how to get out of the harvest. You're not going to get out of the harvest. The crops come due. It's time to harvest. You're going to reap what you've sown. You're not going to get out of the harvest. So the question is, in the midst of the harvest, in the midst of receiving a bad harvest, how do you sow good seed? And let us, verse 9, not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. You know when people lose heart in doing good? It's not in the sowing of the seed. You know that, right?
Yeah.
It's when they start receiving or start reaping a bad harvest while they're sowing good seed. Then it gets awful tiresome to continue to do good. It gets awful hard to continue to sow good seed. If you're always spending every moment of every waking hour cleaning out the weeds out of your garden, how hard is it to continue to plant good stuff in your garden? Well, I would, but I got to take care of all these weeds first. Right? Got to get all the junk out first. How do I deal with that? How do I handle that? That determines the kind of seed that's being sown. Are we planting good seed in this moment? Look, go to Ephesians chapter 4. Starting in verse 17. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But you have not so learned Christ, if indeed you have heard him, and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct, the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, putting away lying, Let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, sowing good seed, sowing good seed, sowing good seed in a time that is rampant with lies and dishonesty, where we are reaping a harvest of lies. What is it to sow good seed? Speak the truth. Speak the truth. Even in the smallest thing that you don't think it really matters, speak the truth.
Always.
Tell the truth. It's not a big deal. I mean, they'll never know. I mean, it's never really going to be a... Stop. You're setting yourself up. You're setting yourself up. You see, they may never know, but guess what? Eventually you're going to reap a harvest. So speak the truth. Be angry and do not sin. That's an interesting one. I gotta laugh at the non-believers that chide the believers and say, "Oh, you're a Christian, you shouldn't be angry. I thought you loved Jesus. Why are you angry?" Because I love Jesus, and you're making me angry. I mean, there was a time that dude ran through the temple with a whip, man. If that ain't anger, I don't know what is. Turning over the tables. I mean, turning over the tables. You know how angry you got to be to turn over some tables and to chase dudes around with a whip. I remember I got my brothers angry once when I was a kid, and my little brothers, and I was like, I thought, I'm an older brother, I'm bigger, I could whoop up on them, right? So I just kept picking at him and picking at him and picking at him. Well, my littlest brother, James, that dude, he was like, he could out-push up me, pull up me, he could out-sit up me. I mean, he's this little tiny dude, every single muscle on his body when he was like 7 years old was just ripped. And it was, the dude could take a whooping too and not even blink an eye and just stare at you. Like, is that it or what? Well, he got tired of me picking on him. And so he decided that what he's going to do, out of anger, was grab a baseball bat. And that dude started chasing me around the yard with a baseball bat. And I was scared because he was angry. And he was strong. Anger will drive you to do some things that you probably wouldn't normally do. And it will drive you to act in ways that you wouldn't normally act. Anger is one of those issues. Anger is one of those emotions. It's one of those feelings that there's a very fine line between sin and no sin. It's a very fine line. How you think. It's not just how it makes you act. Okay. The thoughts that anger causes you to have, are they sin or are they not? The things that anger causes you to say. How many relationships have been ruined because we were stupid enough to open our mouths in a moment of anger? See, a lot of people will say, well, if you didn't really mean it, you wouldn't have said it, so you really meant it. Yeah, I know I really meant it at the time. But it's not something that I would have meant or that I would have said had there not been anger. Right? It didn't express how I always feel. It expressed what I was feeling in the moment. And maybe that's not such a good thing to express sometimes. Because it can do great harm and damage. But anger can be a powerful motivator. It can be a powerful motivator. It caused me to overcome a lot of addictions in my life. Anger. I got angry at it. I got so angry at it that I stopped. And I said, no more.
Yeah. That's right.
I'm not going to do it no more. I don't care. I don't care how it makes me feel. I don't care the pain and the suffering I have to go through. I am so angry at the destructive power of this thing in my life, I refuse to continue to partake.
Amen.
It's a great motivator.
It is.
It can help you accomplish things that were previously impossible.
Yeah. It's true.
Get angry and you find the resolve, you find the strength, you find the ability to stand in the face of opposition that the odds are impossible. All because you're angry. It can do good. It can do so much bad. Moses had an anger issue. Out of anger, he struck the Egyptian. See, he was wanting to save his people, but he was trying to do it out of anger. And it didn't work out for him. We look at our culture and our society today, we see all these things. Look, are there injustices in this nation? Absolutely. Are there issues with some of the justice system in this nation? Absolutely. Are there issues with some racial inequalities in this nation still? Absolutely. But how are we going to deal with those issues? Are we going to do it out of anger? Or are we going to try to come to a place where we can reason together? Because you can't reason with somebody that's angry. Anger is not going to bring us deliverance. Not in this moment. Anger and what others are pushing spiritually will give us the motivation to stand for what we believe. And it should. But it's not to come, look, it's the focus of the anger. Because you realize that every time that you're angry, you focus on what you believe to be the source of that anger. This is how we check our anger. Is it righteous anger or is it not? Well, am I upset at a person? Or am I upset at what's driving the person? Because if I'm upset at a person, then it's probably not righteous anger. If I'm upset at what's driving the person, now I have a place to stand. See, and what that'll do is it will cause us to actually focus in the right spot, which after we move in that area through the motivation that is caused by anger, then we can actually affect change, real change. You're not going to do it by focusing on the person because the person isn't the source of the anger. That's your misconception of the source. But how do I know? Because it's where they're focused. It's where they're focused. You want to know what all these rioters, what all these looters, what all these... You want to know what Antifa is angry about. You want to know what all these movements are angry about. Look at what their focus is. That's what they're angry about. They take their anger out on the place that they perceive to be the source of that anger. It may or may not be true. If it's a person, that's not true. That's not the proper source. That's not the actual source. That's not where it came from. The person may have done horrible things, but that's not the source of those horrible things. The source of those horrible things were what was driving the person. What was motivating the person. What spiritual entity was pushing the person. That's where my anger should be focused. That's the only place that I can affect change. See, then it impacts my prayer life. Then I can come to the Father and I can pray effectively. Why? Because my focus is in the right spot.
Yes.
It's not on the person. It's on what's driving the person. I can pray against the force that's pushing the person. Because I've lifted my eyes to see the true source of the anger. the true source of the injustice, the true source of the problem. Most times, people are just pawns. Yeah, most times we are. We're just pawns. So be angry, but sin not. Be careful in the season. I posted on Facebook. Be careful in the season that your anger doesn't lead you into sin. And then I made another post that said, be careful in the season that someone else's anger doesn't lead you into sin.
Amen.
See, it's not just my anger that I have to be mindful of. It's that of those around me. So it's really easy to get hooked into a passionate cause, right? Oh, they're passionate. No, they're just angry. They're just angry. See, back in the 90s, Warren and I kind of discussed this a little bit before church. Back in the 90s, we had this angry, rebellious teenage movement. Now it's just millennials. They just live with their parents until they're 50.
Rick.
But in the 90s, it was rebellious teenagers, right? And they had a grudge. You ever go back and listen to the music from the 90s?
Oh, yeah.
That's
You
just,
don't have to take it.
that's just angry teenagers, man.
That's true.
Oh, the music is in, you can hear all the kids, oh, it just speaks to me, they're passionate. No, they're just a bunch of angry teenagers. All right? When 16, I got anger issues with my father. Haven't ever been worked out. So I'm going to sing about it. Make millions of dollars.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
So make sure somebody else's anger doesn't lead you into sin.
Yeah.
Nor give place to the devil.
Yeah.
Some of the hardest seasons in which to be a believer are when there is social and civil unrest. We think, oh, well, that's, man, you have to be a believer in this time. I mean, it's going to be the easiest for you in this. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's going to be the hardest. Because you have so many issues in the spiritual realm to contend with. There are so many places. There are so many forces pushing in so many different directions. It is so easy to get sucked into anger that is misproperly focused. It is so easy to get sucked into the issues of the day, and in doing so, it's so easy to actually give Satan place in your life. It's easy to give place to the devil. It's easy to not give place to the devil when things are great. Honestly. And I'm talking like we have an understanding that when things get hard, then I turn to God, right? When things are easy, then I'm not. Because things are easy and I'm just, there's a flip side to that too. And the flip side of that is that when things are easy, then I don't have all these forces pressing against me, and it's easy to actually stand. It's easy to actually just kind of, I've got my routine, I read my Bible, I mean, things are going great, but take one of those little things out of the ecosystem of your life and see how quickly you start to wobble and start to give place in areas where you wouldn't normally give place. Right? Put your thumb on the health for a little bit. See, this is the whole deal that Job was facing. This is the whole thing that Satan was trying to convince God of. God says, hey, have you checked out my servant Job? Satan's like, oh yeah, of course he praises you.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't he? You've given him everything. Not only have you given him everything, but you got this hedge kind of built around him. and I can't get in there. Well, isn't that cool? I mean, just stop and think about that for a second.
Mhm.
But he says, of course he's going to praise you. He said, but let me just disrupt his fragile ecosystem.
Ah,
And we'll see how much he praises you then. So God says, okay, touch everything he's got. See, he didn't just say, interrupt his fragile ecosystem in one spot. God took the hedge that was surrounding all of Job's entire well-being and life, and he brought it down to Job himself, and that meant everybody around Job, everything Job had, was all of a sudden found themselves outside of the covering of God. So then Satan just ran rampant, and the servant came. He said, hey, man, all the livestock are gone. And another servant came. Said, hey, all of this stuff's gone. Another servant came. I mean, this is back to back. While they're standing giving this report, here comes another one, here comes another one, here comes another one. And by the end of it all, he had no kids, he had no livestock, he had no wealth, he had nothing except for an old, bitter, contentious wife.
Yeah.
Satan left him that. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he did.
All the brambles
He
that
did.
they were on.
He's like, no, I'll leave her because she's going to put him down some more.
Yeah.
And it said that the first thing that Job did, that when he had heard all of this, he fell to his knees and worshipped.
That's something. That's
Wow. When he had heard, touch everything in my life.
Yeah.
And when I hear that it's been touched, when I hear that it's been removed, when I hear that it's been stripped away from me, my automatic first response is to fall to my knees and worship. Wow. Wow. Now I know why God said there's none like him in the whole earth. There's none like Job. Why? Because we give place to the devil. And when things go bad, see, the reality is that when things go bad, if our first response is not worship, then that means that somewhere in our life we have already given place to the devil. Because if there wasn't any place for him in our life, our automatic response would just be to worship God. You say, well, you can't say that, Rick. You don't know what I've been through. Well, you don't know what I've been through. So there.
true.
You know? And I'm not saying this to put anybody down because I know this hasn't been my automatic response. So that what it means is now I need to drive in and see where I've given place to the devil in my life. Because there's been times where this has been the automatic response. There's been times where my automatic response is anger, and you say, well, Rick, it's just righteous anger. No, there wasn't anything righteous about it. I can tell you that. It was anger because my little ecosystem got disturbed. Got knocked off kilter a little bit. Threw me out of whack, and I just lost it. Let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give who has need. Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers, and do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. The interesting thing about that quote where in verse 26 where he says, be angry and sin not. It actually is pulled from Psalm chapter 4. I'm going to close with this. Psalm chapter 4. Psalm chapter. Sorry, babe. Joe's watching. It's not chapters in Psalms. They're songs in Psalms. So Psalm 4. He says, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear me when I'm called. Be angry and sin not, but don't just stop there. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. What should we do with anger? Just act, right? Stop. No. When you get so angry, you're just like spitting mad. Go take a root beer break. Get you a nice cold iced tea or something. Sit down, take a break, and think. Think. What am I angry at? Why am I angry? Does this anger justify? Is it really something that I have the right to be angry about? Is this an injustice to me, or am I just hurt at the moment? Is this really something that I should chase and follow, or do I just need to let it go? Is in this moment the saying true, the verse true, where vengeance belongs to the Lord? So maybe I should just scale it back a little bit. One thing about Jesus when he got angry is he got angry for what the leaders who were supposed to represent God on this earth had done with the house of God on this earth. He got angry at the hypocrisy. He got angry because what should have been a house of prayer to all nations, they were using it to further oppress the poor. If we remember the message from last week, we looked at Amos chapter 5. And Amos chapter 5, what he's talking about is that you come to my house, you worship, you sing songs of hymns, and yet you are oppressing the poor. I hate the songs you're singing. I'm not listening. Because in the midst of your worship, the poor are being oppressed. There is injustice running around in the streets. What I would rather see than you just coming together and gathering in your solemn assemblies is I would rather see you deal with unrighteousness and injustice. So those are areas of anger. But it wasn't unrighteousness and injustice projected upon himself, because I remember the moment in Scripture where I see Christ hanging on the cross, the most unjust moment in his life, and yet in that moment he says, Father, forgive them. There's something to be understood about anger that we really need to dig into. Because there is a time to be angry. And there is a time to stand out of anger in righteousness and boldly declare the things of God and boldly stand for the Word of God and allow that anger, that righteous anger, to move you to action. There is a time and a place for that. But we have to seriously understand and discern what and when that is. In our dealings with other people, love one another, gentle to one another, forbearing one another, forgiving one another, even as Christ, for God's sake, forgave you. There's a place, but it's not in our dealings with each other, because we are not the source. We are not the source. It doesn't mean we don't have culpability if we make people angry. It doesn't mean that we didn't step out of line and do something wrong that we need to actually make reparation for.
Yeah.
But there's a greater source that was driving actions. We still have the freedom to make the decision. But it's not the place for anger. It's not the focus. Because all that's going to do is it's going to drive a greater wedge. It's going to cause more division. It's going to cause more problems. We're not going to fix, listen, we're not going to fix any racial issues in our country by continuing to use race to do it. By continuing to label with color, you're not going to fix the racial divide.
No.
You're not. I don't often quote movie stars because I don't really care for anything spiritual that most of them have to say, because there's...
Yeah.
But Denzel Washington did make a good statement. He said, how do you stop race? A corrupt cop killed an innocent man. And in the sentence, what you saw was the sentence actually originally said, a corrupt white cop killed an innocent black man. And he crossed out the white and he crossed out the black. To where the sentence read, a corrupt cop killed an innocent man. That's how you destroy racism. That's how you overcome it. You stop labeling things with color. White privilege, Black Lives Matter. Let's just continue to propagate race. That's all you're doing.
Yep.
All lives matter, and in all races there are privileged people. And the reality of privilege is that at some point in time, somebody worked their butts off to be able to privilege the next generation. And you've got no grounds to stand on for anger about that. Because you could actually work your butt off and provide for the next generation so that they too could be privileged. That's the hope of every generation, isn't it?
Yes.
That you leave the next one more privileged than you were.
Yep.
That you leave them better off than you were. That you give them the ability to where they have to do less of the foundational work to get to where you got. That's the hope of every generation. So that the next one comes in more privileged. That's America. That's everybody. That's worldwide. It's not just America. That's what everybody hopes for. The Bible tells us to leave a righteous man. What does a righteous man do? He leaves an inheritance for his children. It's biblical. It's the kingdom in operation. You leave an inheritance for your children. Flag Day. That in the midst of great contention, we determined to found a nation. What is our determination going to be in the midst of our great conflict? In the opposition in which we face, what are we determined to do? Let's be determined to plant good seed so that we can turn this harvest around. And we don't have to continue passing on that harvest to future generations. Yeah, Lord, we just thank you for your word. Lord, I pray that you would just encourage us today, Lord. Strengthen us. Help us to see the areas, Lord, in our lives where we can really plant some good seed, Lord. Provide seed to the sower, Lord. Lord, I pray that in the midst of this harvest, that we would be discerning, that we would be able to speak truth where it is needed, that we would be able to stand boldly, and Lord, most of all, that we would check our source of anger. Lead us into righteousness, Lord. Let us worship you in spirit and in truth. And Lord, I pray that you just continue to encourage each and every individual here today, Lord, as they go about their weeks. Strengthen them. Lord, just bless them this week. Give them such an amazing week, Lord, that they would look back at the end of this upcoming week and just say, my God is so good. We love you and we pray this in Jesus' name.